Of course, once Jack had gotten off the bus in Seattle, the first thing he did was to knock on the window of an idling taxi just down the block. He gave the driver the destination, a motel out along US Highway 101, aka the Pacific Highway, where he'd booked a room. The motel's preposterous name was the Alpine Country Inn. This luxurious sounding inn smack dab beneath one of the flight paths in and out of SeaTac Airport. All right. Once in his room, first thing Jack did was to call Sheila, who 2 months prior to this had booted her former fiance out of her apartment. The time was just after 11 o'clock in the morning, and for Jack, this was quite early in the day. And in addition to that, he'd slept only in fits and starts, as usual on the bus, so he was a bit groggy. When Sheila tapped into her cell phone to accept Jack's call, she greeted him by saying, "So, you're back in Seattle once again. What sort of plans have you got in mind?" "Oh, you mean, apart from me rehearsing here in my hotel room all afternoon?" "Yes, Jack." "Well, I was hoping I'd be able to see you, sweetheart." "Come by around 6, mister. I'll have dinner ready and steaming on the table." "Damn, Sheila, you can get me worked up just talking about dinner." "Good. I like men who happen to be easily worked up. See you then." The derogatory label of womanizer cannot with complete justification be applied to Jack, if you regard the central defining characteristic of a womanizer to be principally that of a woman chaser. Jack's affairs, both before and after his divorce, were spawned by a feeling of loneliness and a wish for companionship, to share life together for a time. Of course, the lure of pleasures of sex also had much to do with his choice to be friendly with a woman he just met who, let's not mince words, came close to being, if she wasn't already, a knockout. In this case, Jack was driven by sheer impulse, and some of the smarter and better looking women he had known over the years were often amused by how easy it was for them to arouse his interest. Now, owing to his unhealthy habits of smoking and drinking, Jack had become one of those men with rugged good looks. In other words, he gave a false impression of being a tough guy when in actual fact he had always sought to avoid fights. But don't be mistaken about him. There were times when he had fallen into a situation, usually in a cocktail lounge or a tavern, where he would encounter the sort of fellow who loves to pick a fight whenever he gets drunk. And given Jack's occupation, which took him into bars on a regular basis, fights were occasionally inevitable. That Jack earns his living by exercising his wit should not be lost on the reader. In fact, this facet of Jack's character had formed at an early age as a grade school kid when his mother began scolding him on a routine basis for being a smart aleck. and throughout the early phase of his working life, often when he went into a bar for a leisurely drink prior to going home for dinner, some of his more political sounding remarks would trigger the ire in a nearby lowbrow's festering heart, who might then retort out of the blue that he, Jack, was a smartass, a personal attack, and quite clearly an insult. But because Jack was also by no means a feeble-looking dude, incapable of doing much damage in a fight, the more cautious bullies never went any further than casting out a few insults. And to the more persistent aggressors, Jack wound up dishing out some harm, although he more often than not received the worst of it. In a pinch, Jack was perfectly willing to slug another guy, though he viewed fighting in general as unnecessary, decidedly lowbrow and vulgar. And he believed only a hump with no class would do such a thing, egg someone else on with insults and aspersions until blows were exchanged. Roscoe's Comedy Club. Jack was scheduled to be the last warm-up act of the night. A brief intermission to immediately follow prior to the featured comic of the evening, an infamously sharp-tongued comedian who took no heckling from a rowdy audience without popping off some withering comeback. This exchange sometimes gaining further attention in the entertainment section of the following day's newspaper. All the warm-up comics coveted this position, since the last warm-up act was not infrequently referred to by the forthcoming main attraction of the night, whether a man or a woman. So after Jack had returned from the bar and his encouraging talk with T-Bone Jefferson, T-Bone Jefferson, he found this doesn't even make sense. Mentioned previously. He found a seat among the audience and their crowded little tables, and he began to speculate what Bobby Broadside would say about him just before the fellow launched into his own act. Bobby Broadside had the well-deserved reputation for his scathing wit and his occasionally razor-sharp insights into the present-day absurdities of American life. And as mentioned a moment ago, he was also a comic who took no crap from his audience. You could easily see that he'd become rather irritated whenever some unsuspecting fool tossed out a loud interjection from the audience, to which Bobby easily responded with some withering retort, leaving the ticket buyer wishing he had stayed home. Well, ladies and gentlemen, since 15 minutes have passed after Jack Bayfield cracked his last joke, as some of you might still recall, and he's a hell of a good stand-up, so you should all give him a big hand. Yeah, man, he's a true artist. I'll have to work at it to top his motherfucking act. As the audience bellowed out their laughing approval, Jack smiled to himself, thinking, well, I'll be goddamn, that savage little Bobby Broadside has actually given me a boost. And he couldn't wait to tell Sheila when he got back to her apartment. Now it gets a little interesting. Okay, When Jack left the building, nearly all of the lingering crowd had long since gone home. There were always a few stragglers standing around hoping to catch an autograph or take a selfie with the Night Star attraction. That left Jack off the hook. Tonight there was only one guy still lingering, apparently waiting for a cab. Jack walked toward him and then stood a few paces away and said to the other fellow, "Evening, buddy. Well, how'd you like the show?" "I'd never heard of Bobby Broadside before," Bernie said. "I suppose most people think he's a riot, but I found his sense of humor, well, a bit too lower end, if you know what I mean. Actually, I thought your act was funnier and worked better than his." "Hey, thanks, I appreciate that. Look, pal, you wouldn't be waiting for a cab, would you?" "Yeah, that's what I'm doing here," Bernie said. "Well, which direction are you headed? Because if you're going south, we could split the cost of the fare," the money-conscious Jack replied. "I do happen to be going south, as some of those more unlucky folks sometimes say." Jack laughed briefly, then said, "I know what you mean, but listen, man, I'm going the same direction to meet up with a lady friend of mine. What do you say we share a cab?" "Sure, I don't mind," Bernie said. "I'm not the sort who likes to throw money around." The men fell silent for a time. Jack broke this pall beginning to loom by saying, "You sound like a local guy. You from Seattle?" "No, Bellingham." "No kidding." "I've done shows there, of course. Love that little town," Jack said. "Yeah, I was just there the other day." "Where are you from?" "Somewhere in the Northwest, I expect." "Oh, you better believe it, man. Moses Lake, the deepest armpit in the state of Washington." Presently, a taxi pulled up to the curb and the men got in. Jack sat by himself in the back seat, while Bernie got in the front passenger seat. While the driver asked Bernie where they wanted to go, he said, "Well, I don't know about the gentleman in the back. We're strangers merely sharing a cab, but I'd like to go to the Pacific Rim Apartments." "Sure, I know the place. At this time of night I can get you there in just under 8 minutes." In the back seat, Jack blurted out, "Hey, buddy, you did say the Pacific Rim Apartments, didn't you?" "Yes, just a moment ago. You weren't mistaken." "Well, this is quite a coincidence, man. The woman I'm going to see lives in one of those apartments. How do you like that? God damn, what are the chances?" "Well," said Bernie, now somewhat irritated that he wouldn't be getting out of the cab by himself, "it's hardly out of the question. There must be at least 20 buildings in that apartment complex." "Still," Jack said, trailing off while remaining taken aback by this, what seemed to him, this unlikely set of circumstances. Bernie leaned back in his seat and said nothing while Jack and the driver engaged in what to him sounded like a spontaneous dialogue. Jack, a long-time rider of Greyhound, was merely doing what he normally did, which was to strike up a conversation to help the time of a tedious journey to pass more quickly. When, in less than 10 minutes, they'd arrived at the Pacific Rim Apartments, Bernie and Jack each paid the driver $15 and left it at that. As the cabbie drove away from the curb, Jack said, "A deal like this calls for introductions. You may have forgotten my name already, Jack Bayfield." "Bernie Youngers, good to meet you." They shook hands and departed from one another, each going their separate way. Bernie taking his usual little shortcut, and Jack strolled toward the building where Sheila lived. And as Jack strolled toward the building where Sheila lived, he briefly wondered why the lie about his hometown popped out of his mouth. After all, he'd been born and raised in Spokane, not nearby Moses Lake. Why had he done this? For the sake of a one-liner? Jack couldn't say. A few minutes later, these two men happened to spot one another again as the gap between them gradually narrowed and they stepped up to each other, now only a few feet apart. Bernie lived in building E5, and for a moment he eyed Jack suspiciously. Jack said, "Hey man, you won't believe this, but this woman Sheila I'm gonna see, well, she lives right here in this fucking building, man." Bernie said to him, "Sheila? Did you say this woman's name was Sheila?" "Yeah, why do you ask?" Jack replied, more than a bit curious. This curiosity quickly tinged with a mounting suspicion. "Well, I met a woman a few weeks ago at the Coconut Grove," Bernie said. The Coconut Grove was the nearby cocktail lounge frequented by the over 40 crowd. "We talked for a while and got to know one another a bit." Bernie nearly continued to say that this lady, who was average height for a woman, nice looking, and one could say blessed with natural and very ample endowments, had walked back to his apartment with him. They'd been having a grand time talking and joking with one another, and both finally concluded at roughly the same time that it would be a shame to merely depart from one another and go their separate ways upon leaving the Coconut Grove. And although she'd soon come to regard Bernie as, well, as it were, a sophisticated gentleman who seemed well informed and, one wouldn't say brimming with cultural and scientific knowledge, but Sheila could tell that Bernie was no dummy, just a little bit eccentric. Jack, now having realized that they were talking about the same woman, cleared his throat and said, "Fucking hey, this is too much, man. You know what? We should drop in on her together. Wouldn't that be a gas to see her eyes light up and get as wide as they ever do? What do you say, Bernie? Sheila would think it was a trippy. Hell, I'll bet she would even say so as soon as we step in through the door." "Well, I don't know," he said with dubious caution. "Don't you expect she might feel a bit embarrassed, or at least taken by surprise? She might not appreciate this gag you've just cooked up." "Oh, fuck, she'd love it," Jack insisted. "She's into astrology and ESP and clairvoyance, UFOs, fuck. She even believes in UFOs, for hell's sake." Now, rather intrigued over what might develop out of this incipient little group of theirs, Bernie reluctantly agreed. "All right, but don't worry, I'll just stay for only a few minutes." "Ah, fuck, don't worry about it. She'll be happy to see you."